Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to get into something that I think is going to be super interesting. We're going to be talking about privatization
Yes.
and deregulation.
Yes.
Um, and I know that might sound a little bit dry, a little bit technical,
Hmm.
but believe me, this is something that affects all of us every single day. And you know what? It might actually be a little more exciting than you think.
Absolutely.
So before we jump into the nitty-gritty, I just want to kind of set the stage here, make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Um, so when we talk about privatization and deregulation, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, in a nutshell, we're talking about a shift from the government being in charge of something to private companies taking the reins.
Oh, okay. So instead of the city running the bus system, a private company comes in and takes over.
Precisely. And that can have a whole ripple effect. Think about it. Would your bus ride be smoother or bumpier?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. And would everybody still get a seat, or would some people get left behind?
Exactly. Those are the kind of questions we're going to be exploring today.
Okay. This is already making my brain do some gymnastics. So is this whole privatization thing a good thing or a bad thing?
The million-dollar question. Well, it's complicated, as with most things. There's no easy answer. There are definitely strong arguments on both sides.
Okay, so let's break it down then. What are some of the main arguments in favor of privatization?
Well, one of the biggest ones is efficiency. Private companies, they have to watch their bottom line. They're always looking for ways to cut costs and streamline operations to, do more with less.
Okay, yeah. Efficiency sounds like a good thing in theory, but is it always the most important thing? Especially when we're talking about essential services, things that everyone needs like schools or healthcare.
That's a really important point. And you're right, it's not always just about efficiency. We also have to consider fairness and quality. Take veterans' health care, for example.
Okay.
There's been this push to let veterans get care from private doctors instead of solely relying on the VA, the government-run system. Now, on the surface, that might sound good. Private companies, they often boast about faster appointments, shorter wait times.
Right. Makes sense.
But here's the thing. Studies have shown that the VA actually often provides better overall care for veterans.
Really?
Yep. So it's not just about how quickly you can get an appointment, it's about the quality of care you receive.
Wow. So it's more nuanced than just saying private companies are always more efficient.
Absolutely. It's about weighing those trade-offs, efficiency cost, and most importantly, quality of service. We have to ask ourselves who ultimately benefits and who might get left behind.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So let's bring this a little closer to home. I mean, we're talking to high schoolers here. What about some examples of privatization and deregulation that might affect them directly?
You bet. Privatization is happening in areas that touch your lives every single day. Let's take education, for example. Charter schools are a prime example.
Okay, charter schools. Yeah, I've heard of those. But how do they fit into this whole privatization thing?
So, charter schools are publicly funded, which means tax dollars support them, but they're privately run. They have more freedom to try different teaching methods and create their own curriculums.
Interesting. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? More flexibility? I mean, it sounds good.
Well, that's the debate, isn't it? Supporters argue that charter schools give parents more options and can boost overall education quality. Critics, though, they worry that charter schools might actually worsen inequality.
How so?
Well, think about it. What if the most motivated students and the parents who are really involved, they all flock to these charter schools? What happens to the public schools that are left behind? Do they get better or do they struggle even more?
I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's
That's a good point. Okay, so charter schools are one example. What about college? I mean, everyone's thinking about college, right?
Absolutely. And privatization even plays a role in how you pay for it.
Really?
Student loans are a huge deal, right?
Yeah, tell me about it.
And while the government offers federal student loans, private companies are becoming more and more involved in this area. They offer loans with different interest rates and repayment options.
So it's like choosing a phone plan. You got to shop around and compare different offers.
Kind of. But here's the catch. Some private lenders have been accused of not treating borrowers fairly. There have been cases where students felt misled or trapped in loans they couldn't afford.
Wow. So it's kind of a mixed bag with student loans, too.
You got it. It can be tough to navigate. And speaking of tough to navigate, let's talk about something that might seem like ancient history to you guys, the postal service.
The postal service. You mean like snail mail? Who even sends letters anymore?
You'd be surprised. It might seem old-fashioned, but the postal service is still a lifeline, especially for people in rural areas who might not have as many delivery options.
Okay, that's true. But I've heard that the Postal Service has been having some financial troubles.
Yeah, that's right. They've been struggling for years, partly because people just don't rely on mail as much as they used to. But they also have these massive pension obligations, which means they have to pay a lot of money to retired postal workers. It's a big financial burden.
Okay, so where does privatization fit into all of this?
Well, some folks believe that a private company could swoop in and run the postal service more efficiently. They think a private company would be more likely to cut costs and find new ways to, make money.
But wouldn't that mean that some people might lose their mail service? Like, what if it's not profitable to deliver mail to certain areas?
That's exactly the concern. Critics worry that a private company would prioritize profits over people. They might cut service to areas that are harder to reach or don't bring in as much revenue.
Yikes. That would be a big problem for a lot of folks. So this whole privatization thing is definitely a double-edged sword.
You got it. There are potential benefits and drawbacks. And to really wrap our heads around it, we need to look at some real-world examples.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with your best examples.
Let's do it. Okay, so let's dive into some real-world situations where this whole privatization thing is playing out. One that might surprise you is prisons.
Prisons. Wait, like actual jails?
Yep, you heard that right. In the United States, we actually have private prisons, which means they're run by for-profit companies.
Whoa, I had no idea.
Yeah.
So it's basically like a company coming in and saying, hey, we'll run your school. But instead of classrooms, it's, well, prison cells.
Exactly. It's a pretty wild concept, and as you can imagine, it's super controversial.
Yeah, I bet. So what are the arguments for and against private prisons?
Well, supporters say they can save taxpayers money because private companies are supposedly more efficient at running things, cutting costs and all that.
Okay. But on the flip side, doesn't that create a situation where these companies are incentivized to, like, cut corners? I mean, they're trying to make a profit, right?
That's the big fear. Critics argue that private prisons might skimp on things like food, health care, or even security to boost their profits, essentially putting profits ahead of people.
That's disturbing.
Yeah.
So are there any real-world examples of that happening?
Unfortunately, yes. There have been cases where private prisons have been accused of neglecting inmates' health and safety just to save a buck.
That's just wrong. Okay, so we've seen some examples where privatization might not be such a great idea. But you said earlier that it's not always bad, right? There must be some cases where it actually works out.
Absolutely. Privatization can sometimes lead to lower prices and give consumers more choices.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about phone service. Back in the day, there was basically just one phone company, and everyone paid pretty much the same price.
Right.
Then came deregulation, and suddenly we had tons of options, different companies, different plans, different features.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of like choosing the streaming service these days.
Really?
So many options. It can be overwhelming.
Exactly. That's the trade-off. More choices can be great, but it can also get confusing, and some folks might end up paying more because they don't understand all the fine print.
Right. You got to be a savvy consumer.
You got it. And deregulation can sometimes lead to job losses, too, which is a major concern. Well, if a private company takes over something that used to be run by the government, they might decide to lay off workers to cut costs, or they might reduce wages or benefits.
Right. So it's not just about prices and choices.
Yeah.
There are social implications, too.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance between efficiency and fairness.
My head is spinning. This is complex stuff. It seems like there's so many factors to consider.
It definitely is. And to help us navigate this complexity, there's this concept called stranded costs that can shed some light on the potential downsides of privatization.
Stranded costs, what are those?
Imagine your school builds a brand new state-of-the-art gym, but then a private company comes in and says, nah, we don't want to use that gym. The school is stuck with the cost of that gym, even though it's not being used. That's a stranded cost.
Ouch. So it's like buying a pair of shoes that you never wear. They just sit in your closet taking up space.
Exactly. Except in this case, we're not talking about shoes. We're talking about millions or even billions of dollars.
Wow. That's a lot of money down the drain.
Yeah.
So it's important to think about those long-term costs.
You got it. And who ends up paying for them?
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about efficiency, fairness, stranded costs.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I still want to know who are the winners and losers in all of this?
That's the key question, isn't it? And as we've been discussing, it's not always clear-cut. Sometimes consumers benefit from privatization because it can lead to lower prices and more choices. But it's crucial to make sure those savings are actually passed on to consumers and not just lining the pockets of the companies.
Yeah, and what about the people who might get left behind? What about the workers who might lose their jobs, or the communities that might lose access to essential services?
You're hitting the nail on the head. It's all about weighing those trade-offs and thinking about the broader impact. Privatization isn't inherently good or bad. It's about going into it with open eyes, asking the tough questions, and holding those in power accountable.
This has been a super eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm starting to understand this whole privatization and deregulation thing in a much deeper way.
That's what we like to hear. But remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's always more to learn, and the world is constantly changing.
Okay, so what can I do? I'm just one person. I don't have a lot of power to change things.
Don't underestimate yourself. The first step is to stay informed. Read articles, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts, talk to people who have different viewpoints. The more you know, the better equipped you'll be to form your own opinions and make your voice heard.
Okay, I can do that. Read, watch, listen, talk.
Got it.
But what if I do all that and I still have questions?
That's where critical thinking comes in. Don't just accept everything you hear at face value. Ask questions, challenge assumptions, think about the potential consequences of different policies, engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views.
So if someone's trying to convince me that privatizing the school cafeteria would be amazing, I should ask. But what about the students who can't afford the new prices? Or what happens to the cafeteria workers' jobs?
Exactly, you're on the right track. Remember, there's rarely one right answer when it comes to these issues. It's all about gathering information, considering different perspectives, and making informed decisions that align with your values.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of this complex topic.
We're glad to hear it. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn, and the world is constantly changing.
Okay, I'm ready for the challenge.
Great. Here's something to ponder. Think of something the government does now. What if it was privatized? Would it be better or worse? Play it out in your mind. Explore the potential benefits and drawbacks.
That's a great challenge. I'm gonna have to put my thinking cap on for that one.
We have faith in you. And hey, if you're enjoying this deep dive, be sure to tell your friends to subscribe so they don't miss out on future episodes.
Yeah, spread the word. The more the merrier.
Absolutely. We love having you all along for the ride.
Well, that about wraps it up for today's deep dive on privatization and deregulation.
It's been a pleasure exploring this complex issue with you all.
A huge thank you to our expert for breaking down this topic and making it so understandable.
My pleasure. Always happy to geek out about policy stuff.
And to all our listeners out there, remember, stay curious. Keep asking those tough questions and never stop learning.
Until next time, stay engaged and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
See you all on the next deep dive.